Thank you. Thank you very much for a very kind introduction. It is wonderful to be back here in Korea. It's a place I love to visit. I'm very fortunate that what I do now in the OpenChain project has a deep connection with Korea. We have an active community that meets around once every 2 months, led by Haksung Jang of SK Telecom, who's in the audience today. Korea has been part of innovation for so many years, and in the area of open source, it has been a leader thanks to companies such as Samsung and Hyundai and LG Electronics and so many more. Most of all, thanks to the energy and enthusiasm of the people behind the companies. Now, what we're going to do today is to talk about a very simple thing, about how the field of open source, something that's key to open innovation and key to all innovation, about how the field of open source has matured and grown up. So we're going to talk really about how open source has become more professional, how it has become more manageable, and how it has become more accountable and sustainable. So this talk is really about the big picture of lasting, reliable open innovation. I'm going to provide context for that picture through the example of what I do today with the OpenChain project and how we manage the supply chain of open source. Now, there are many sections to my talk. I won't go into in detail what we're going to talk about. I'll just dive in and talk about it. The first challenge with managing anything is really moving from the unknown into the known. In the field of open source, we have spent a lot of time looking at the potential and saying, how do we structure this? How do we structure all of the potential of collaboration into practical outcomes for the market? In the context of what I do around supply chain management, that means creating reliable, structured process management. So in our case, it means looking at the big picture and saying, how do we stack management solutions in a way that allows us to take something like open source into the supply chain and ensure that it's reliable? What I do, OpenChain, operates at the very high level, process management. And there are other standards, for example, implementation standards for software bill of materials, so you can describe what's flowing through the supply chain. And there are methodologies such as open source program offices, supported by projects like To-Do Group, or metrics supported like projects such as Chaos. The things I've just cited in this pyramid are all from the Linux Foundation, which is the trade association that I'm part of. Of course, there are other options and alternatives in the market as well. The important point is that we can stack things from the high-level context of processes all the way down to the most detailed implementation methods. In my case, the focus is process management, high level, and we've built 2 ISO standards to manage open source. ISO 5230, Open Source License Compliance, and ISO 18974 for Open Source Security Assurance. License compliance and security assurance are 2 of the key topics in open source and in any software. That's why we built ISO standards to manage the processes in those areas. If you want to move open source through the supply chain, you need to be able to take care of these two things at a minimum. Our approach was to try to make sure every company in every geography in the world could benefit from the existence of such standards. We kept them simple and high level. We made sure that they were very practical and therefore useful for anyone, and we developed them openly. Every meeting was open to everyone to come and share their notes and ideas. As I mentioned, we have a Korean work group. It operates in Korean. We have work groups in China, Japan, Germany, and elsewhere, trying to make sure that no matter what language people had, what business culture they had, they could be part of building these standards and other material in the future. We've been very fortunate to work not only with companies, but also with governments and with non-corporate entities, NGOs of various sorts, with truly global cooperation around making this type of process management. Now, the two standards I mentioned are sister standards, and they're very, very similar. This is purposeful. We want to make sure that these are flexible standards, and if you adopt one, you can quite easily adopt the other. The idea is that companies can start working on things like open source license compliance or security assurance, and then grow into addressing both using international standards. These are about process points. Essentially, they're quality standards for managing open source. They're not about going into the detail of how you should do X process content. Again, simple and high level, part of that pyramid so people can stack other things together to fill out what they need to do overall. If you're interested, you can get full details of our ISO standards at these QR codes. We try to provide as much information as possible and let you choose what you need to get started. At those QR codes, you can also do things like self-certify to our standards, which is what a lot of companies do in practice. Now, I've been talking about some details of the OpenChain project, and we must remember why. Pulling back, we're here to talk about how open source has become more professional, more auditable, more sustainable, more accountable. The choice of something like ISO standards is part of that. ISO standards are a shorthand for the type of expected approaches, the type of reliable, the type of reputationally strong approaches that the entire world can understand. To support open source being more professional and more accountable and more sustainable, we built these ISO standards as an international baseline so that a company in Korea talking to a company in America, talking to a company in Vietnam, could use a very clear international language of standards describing what is quality in managing this in the supply chain. The progress has been very good in this type of approach. For example, when it comes to the OpenChain project, we have seen a continual heartbeat of public adoption around our standards. Recent announcements of adopting our standards include Nokia, OpenHarmony, KT, and Samsung SDS. Obviously, the last two are of special interest to this room, and I'll give you more details in a moment. The big picture is that when you make an international standard, anyone can use it. When you build an international standard in something like open source, companies often take a leadership position. They communicate their use to help inspire others, to help inspire the rest of the supply chain. Nokia adopted our ISO standard 5230 for license compliance. They announced it recently, and they asked for their announcement to be broadcast on our website and across social media to let other companies in the telecommunications supply chain know that in Nokia's opinion, if you're managing open source in the supply chain, this is the ISO standard to address license compliance. It was similar in China when Open Harmony, part of the Open Atom Foundation, adopted the same ISO standard for license compliance. In this case, Open Harmony is an operating system community. It's not a company. It's many companies collaborating to build an alternative to technologies like Android. They started using the ISO standard and announced that that was their baseline for how to make open source license compliance professional. In Korea, for example, just a few days ago, Korea Telecom announced the adoption of our open source security standard, ISO 18974, indicating very clearly that they saw this standard as the baseline for open source security assurance. Samsung SDS, their adoption of the security standard, exactly the same story. By the way, Korean companies have been fabulous in adopting our ISO standards and promoting their adoption around the world to inspire others. Just one example would be Kakao Bank adopting our security standard a little while ago. These activities, these leadership activities, help make sure that the supply chain around the world aligns quickly. A data point that I thought might be useful is from PwC. Now, with open standards, you have no idea who's using them unless they tell you they're using them. But you do get market research, and recently PwC sponsored research in Germany that indicated 31% of larger German companies are using or plan to use our ISO standard for open source license compliance. That shows the type of momentum in the market to change things, to make things more professional. The next question is, how do people use this stuff? How do they make it happen? When it comes to something like the OpenChain standards, and they are a good example for other standards, there are multiple methods of adoption. For example, you may self-certify. For instance, you might fill out a checklist and say, yes, this checklist, I meet all the requirements. Or you may third-party certify. Have someone like TÜV SÜD or Buono Veritas or PwC audit a company and check, do they meet the standard? This happens with the OpenChain standards, as it happens with all other ISO standards, whether it's a quality standard like ISO 9001 or a safety standard like ISO 26262. Now, when it comes to self-certification, OpenChain actively promotes that. And don't worry, you don't need to read all of this text. I'm sure the slides will be available on the ETRI website. They will be available on the OpenChain website. Long story short, OpenChain promotes and supports self-certification, everything from checklists to reference material to the active community like the OpenChain Korea Workgroup. We try to help make sure that any company can improve their professional engagement, to reduce the unknown around open source, and to align themselves with best practices. Third-party certification adds a layer of audit. It also, of course, adds a layer of additional expense. It's therefore a business choice. In some industries, such as automotive or aerospace or defense, companies might have a normal practice of third-party audits, third-party certification. And we've made sure that there's a global community, currently 15 official certifiers for the OpenChain project. But these are open standards. Anyone who can certify for ISO can certify these ISO standards. This all applies not only to OpenChain, it applies to all of the ISO standards appearing for managing open source, like ISO 5962, SPDX for software bill of materials. These are all examples of the professionalization of the field. Now, I've mentioned the support material and network. Let's dig into that a bit. Here's an example of the currently active study and work groups around the OpenChain project. The core is the specification work group, which is meeting actually right now as I'm on stage. And they develop the standards. They collaborate with the core education work group to make reference material around the standards. There are industry-specific work groups, like in automotive and telecommunications, regional work groups in places like China, Japan, Korea. And of course, there's additional stuff, like we have an automation work group to talk about tooling, how to make things like compliance work at scale. And we have an AI study group, which tries to discuss AI compliance in the supply chain. And we're just opening a new one for software bill of materials. All of that stuff is about people sitting down and saying, how do we share knowledge and make this more professional? When it comes to sharing knowledge, you might want to check out this QR code. OpenChain has what might be the largest library of reference material in the world related to managing open source, from policy templates to training material to self-certification checklists to detailed items around how to understand, contextualize, and make decisions. We have it in there in multiple languages, including, of course, quite a bit in Korean, thanks to the local community. Two examples of recent releases that are directly relevant to Korea are a guide which originally came from Japan, managing your open source software supply chain. The second edition came out and has updates to reflect market developments. The second edition was developed by the global community. The other item is the Telco SBOM guide. Now, of course, that was designed by telecommunication companies like Ericsson, Nokia, KDDI. But what it's about matters to every company in the world. It's about the question of what is a quality SBOM? Not what's a format, but what is a quality SBOM for practical supply chain management? And of course, we have tons of case studies, everything from Toyota through to German automotive companies, talking about how and why they use standards to make open source more professional. Some of them, like a recent three-way case study with BlackBerry in Canada, explain the justification for adopting standards, the business case for it. Some, like for instance, a recent study with a smaller company in Europe, go into great technical detail of how they did it. We make free training courses, and these again are illustrative of bigger market developments. We have training courses for things like open source license compliance. These have been adopted by companies like Bosch and Continental and KPMG as required training for their engineers. There are plenty of other training courses provided by plenty of other parties to help with other aspects of reliable, repeatable open source management. We also have, and this is an accident, quite frankly, we have one of the largest webinar libraries around open source management. When COVID hit in April 2020, we decided that we would do something to help support the community information sharing because all the conferences were ending. And we asked our community to do webinars about license management, security management, open source processes, mergers and acquisitions. And it's been a constant series of webinar releases since then. We're very fortunate. And on our website, you can quickly look at them and go through the categories. Freely accessible, of course. Two examples of recent webinars relate to AI. One covers the legal landscape. In other words, the lawsuits and direct risks happening in AI at the moment, because that's a big topic for the supply chain. And people rarely say AI without saying open source AI. And that means our stakeholders are concerned. What do we do? We had a law firm in the US give a very detailed answer to the current situation. We recently had an expert who used to work at Microsoft as counsel and now is working at his own company, go into detail regarding data and AI, which, as you're probably aware, is one of the largest and most important topics for the supply chain. Any supplier may say, I'm giving you an AI tool. Your first question is probably, that's nice. Where did the data come from, and how do I manage it? So we're talking about these things as a community service. We are part of a larger dialogue. In the next month, you'll see more webinars from other parties like Inner Source Commons Foundation and Open Source Initiative, talking about this and other matters. We all try to collaborate. We try to make sure that our information complements each other. One thing that's very exciting and that will be released at the end of October in Japan at something we call the Open Compliance Summit is a maturity model. Companies use maturity models to determine how they are improving. In open source, we're just beginning to see the emergence of maturity modeling. Some large companies, like Deloitte or PwC, can offer maturity modeling services. To support our community around open source, we're going to release maturity model reference material into the public domain under CC0 licensing. So every company in the world can look at maturity modeling, can think about continuous improvement of professional, sustainable open source, and decide how their company can improve over time, or how their government can improve over time, or their NGO. I mentioned commercial support for things like the OpenChain project. We have an extensive community of legal providers, tooling vendors, consultancies, and third-party certifiers that explicitly work with us. But because we make ISO standards, there's no dependency on working with us. Any provider of ISO support can provide support around these type of things. Getting close to wrapping up, the question is, with the existence of stuff like ISO standards to manage open source, with clear market momentum, what are the developments for the market? What should I be thinking about as the consequence of all of this? One of the consequences in open source growing up and becoming more professional relates to procurement. So this is essentially the most basic part of supply chain. Things like ISO standards for open source license compliance and ISO standards for open source security assurance are a simple ask in procurement for any industry. You can ask your suppliers, do you use these standards? And if they say no, you ask, why are you not using the international standards? There is a simple way to try to make sure that people are aligned around decades of experience. And we do see, I think, in the near future, more and more people using that type of approach, asking for industry standards instead of having custom ways to try to manage their supply chain. Of course, we also see increased adoption specifically of our standards, but all standards, instead of bespoke, unique approaches. In mergers and acquisitions, we also see changes. We were surprised how OpenChain standards, but all standards related to open source, are very quickly being used as a floor to check for quality and risk management in mergers and acquisitions. It's becoming a very common question to say, are you using the international standard for X to manage Y? Are you using the ISO standard for license compliance? Are you using the ISO standard for security assurance? If not, why not? Sometimes it's used for pure risk containment. Sometimes it's used for price negotiation. Regardless, they've proven to be useful tools, and we do expect the OpenChain standards to increasingly be part of M&A. We're going to try and support that with case studies over time so that it will become easier for law firms in, for example, Korea, to join their peers in places like the United States and Germany in having this tool in their portfolio. Now, when it comes to overall supply chain management, we do think that the ISO standards we build and the ISO standards that others have built for open source make it easier to manage the supply chain. That's why we built them, to make it cheaper, faster, and more reliable. We expect the global supply chain to feature more and more requests for the use of OpenChain standards and other standards. And we do expect things like the maturity modeling I just referenced to become a norm. In areas like automotive, everyone is familiar with things like Toyota's Kaizen methodology, continual improvement. Now that we have a professional floor for open source, we have basic standards, we expect people to meet the floor and then gradual improvement through maturity modeling across the market. Perhaps most excitingly for this room, given the amount of government people, addressing stuff like the US executive order, the NIST minimum requirements for software bill of materials, and CISA publications around how the US government expects software to work. OpenChain has addressed the requirements that they're bringing to the market since we started. Since day one in 2015, we decided that a software bill of materials was necessary to manage open source, period. So we fully support the foundation of where US policy and regulation is going, and we always have. We're aligned also with others, for example, in Europe, with the CRA. When it comes to the CRA, it's basically about record keeping. And we've always required artifacts and record keeping around open source. Just like SBOM, it seemed obvious to us that that was going to be something we need. You can't deploy something like software and then in 10 years ask, what happened, without software bill of materials and records. So we support where the CRA is going and that type of regulatory approach. We're aligned with these movements in the market. When it comes to other standards, we've also worked to be compatible. We're compatible with all of the standards around compliance and security and SBOM that we are aware of. Partly, this is because we're very high level. we suggest process points and we don't go into detail. And other standards are the next step of detail. Speaking more broadly, we always sat down and thought, how can a company with 10 people use the same standard as a company with 3 million? How can we take that type of approach and that type of compatibility? You can find out more about some of the policy side of things through some of the webinars we did. We recently had a special series on European CRA, AI, and Product Liability Directive. And our goal was to see exactly where the European Union is going and to help make sure our community was fully aligned. And we want to do the same, of course, for Korea. I'm positive that in Korea there's plenty of government discussion on this topic, and I'm sure we can be part of that discussion, but also part of making sure others are aware of it. In Japan, the Japanese government has released a lot of papers on software bill of materials. We're examining that, getting ready to communicate it with the world, and as soon as Japan moves to regulation, we're going to explain clearly how that fits into the US regulation and the EU regulations and so on and so forth. We're in the final part now, concluding everything. So what's happening? Things are getting more formal out there. We're beginning to align around standards in open source. There's an increased use in areas like mine with the OpenChain standards for license compliance and security assurance. And this is improving trust in the supply chain. For the remainder of this year and into next year, we expect the awareness and capability around open source standards to become key for companies. Companies that are able to use these standards will operate effectively against their global competitors. Companies which do not understand and use these standards will face a challenge against their competitors. Open source itself, like I said at the beginning, is becoming more professional, more accountable, and more sustainable. Whether it's the CRA in Europe holding it to account, or whether it's the ISO standards like OpenChain making it more professional, or whether it's the long-term result of all of this making it more sustainable. Open source is becoming much closer to traditional software asset management. It's not a unique unknown. It's not a surprise anymore. We know how to manage this. OpenChain will continue to assist in this. We will help the professionalization. We specifically want to work on procurement, M&A, and supply chain management. We'll continue to build reference material to help companies adopting our standards and other standards. And of course, we will support future discussions in new areas like AI compliance. You can track all of our work online because we are an open project. We develop open standards in the same way that programmers make open source code. You can join the Korea work group by joining their mailing list and turning up at the next meeting. There is zero barrier to entry. We benefit from this type of collaboration. And of course, you can contact me at any time to talk about any part of this. Whether you want to talk about policy development, whether you want to talk about how your business can use a standard, or how your business is finding challenges in using standards, I'm here to help. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you. 여러분 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. Please now return to your seat.